The quiet pattern. St. Mary Mead had always possessed a way of appearing far simpler than it truly was. To the casual visitor, it was the very image of English village life. Trim hedges, well-kept gardens, and a sense of calm so steady that one might easily believe nothing of consequence ever occurred there. But Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to observe both people and places with careful attention, knew better. Human nature, she often remarked, is much the same everywhere. It is only the scale that changes, and in St. Mary Mead the scale was small but no less significant. The matter began, as many things did, with something so trivial that it scarcely seemed worth mentioning. Mrs. Price Ridley's strawberry preserves had spoiled. Not merely turned slightly, as preserves sometimes did when improperly sealed, but entirely ruined, sour, discoloured, and quite inedible. "It is most extraordinary," Mrs. Price Ridley declared to anyone who would listen, her voice tinged with indignation. "I have made preserves for 20 years, and never once has this happened." Miss Marple, who had been present when the complaint was first aired at the vicarage tea, had listened politely, her head inclined just so, her expression mild. "Perhaps the fruit was not quite right," suggested Mrs. Bantry. "Nonsense," Mrs. Price Ridley replied. "I selected it myself." Miss Marple said nothing, but she did not entirely dismiss the matter. A few days later, there was another incident. Equally small, equally curious. Mr. Leonard Briggs, a man of particular pride in his roses, discovered that several of his finest blooms had been damaged overnight. Not entirely destroyed, but spoiled just enough to ruin their appearance. "Someone has been careless," he insisted. Or worse, deliberate. The suggestion of deliberate action caused a ripple of mild alarm among those who heard it, though it was quickly dismissed. "Surely not," said Mrs. Bantry. "What possible reason could there be?" Mr. Briggs could not answer that, and so the matter rested, though not entirely comfortably. Miss Marple, walking slowly home that afternoon, considered both incidents with quiet interest. Neither, on its own, was remarkable. Preserves spoiled. Flowers suffered from pests or weather. Such things happened, and yet there was something about them that did not sit quite right. "It is often the smallest things," she murmured to herself, "that begin the most curious patterns." The next occurrence came in the form of a misplaced letter. Mrs. Eliza Morton, a woman known for her careful habits, reported that an important piece of correspondence had gone missing, only to reappear days later in a most unexpected place. "I am certain I did not put it there," she insisted. "It is quite unlike me." The letter itself, when found, appeared untouched, but its temporary absence had caused considerable inconvenience. Miss Marple, upon hearing of it, felt that same faint stirring of unease. Not alarm, nothing so dramatic, but a quiet awareness that something, however small, was not entirely as it should be. By the end of the week the incidents had begun to accumulate. A batch of scones at the vicarage tea turned out inexplicably salty. A newly planted row of seedlings failed without clear cause. A visiting guest found herself the subject of an awkward social misunderstanding, brought about by information that had somehow been altered. Each event, taken alone, was insignificant. Together they formed something less easily dismissed. "It is most unfortunate," Mrs. Bantry said. "Such a run of bad luck." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "most unfortunate." It was on a particularly mild afternoon that Miss Marple found herself seated in her garden, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, her gaze directed not at her work, but at the neat rows of flowers before her. The air was still, the sunlight gentle, and the village seemed, as always, perfectly at peace. And yet, she could not quite shake the feeling that something lay beneath that peace. "Patterns," she said quietly. "One must always look for patterns." She thought again of the preserves, the roses, the letter, the small embarrassments. Each had affected a different person. Each had been minor, and yet each had caused just enough disturbance to be noticed. "Not random," she murmured. "Not entirely." The thought did not fully form then, but it lingered, waiting. It was Mrs. Bantry who brought the next piece of news, arriving at Miss Marple's gate with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "My dear Jane," she said, "have you heard about Mrs. Harcourt?" Miss Marple looked up. "No," she said. "What has happened?" Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice slightly, though there was no one nearby to overhear. "She has taken ill," Quite suddenly. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. Mrs. Adeline Harcourt? Yes. How very unfortunate, Mrs. Bantry nodded. They say it came on after she had some jam, homemade, I believe. Given to her by one of the neighbours. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her calmly. Jam? She repeated. Yes, quite a nice gift, apparently, though it seems it did not agree with her. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then very softly she said, I see. Mrs. Harcourt was a woman of some standing in St. Mary Mead. Well liked, certainly, though perhaps not without her complexities. She possessed a charm that many found agreeable, and a manner that suggested kindness. But Miss Marple, who observed rather than assumed, had long ago noted that such charm could sometimes conceal other qualities. A most capable woman, she had once remarked, and very aware. It was not criticism, merely observation. I do hope it is nothing serious, Mrs. Bantry continued, though the doctor seemed concerned. Miss Marple inclined her head. I am sure he will do everything possible. But her thoughts had already begun to move in a different direction. Jam, preserves, spoilage, a small quiet pattern, stretching now towards something less trivial. That evening, as the light faded and the village settled into its usual calm, Miss Marple sat once more by her window. The events of the past days arranged themselves in her mind with increasing clarity. Not conclusions, she was far too cautious for that, but connections. It begins so gently, she murmured, so harmlessly. A spoiled jar, a damaged flower, a misplaced letter, and now a sudden illness. She did not yet think of danger, not quite, but she did think of intention, and that, she knew, made all the difference. Outside, St. Mary Mead remained as it always appeared, quiet, orderly, untouched. But Miss Marple, watching the soft movement of leaves in the evening air, allowed herself the smallest of frowns, because she had seen such patterns before, and she knew from long experience that when something began with such careful subtlety, it rarely ended the same way. Patience, she said softly, that is the key. And somewhere, though no one yet realized it, patience was already at work. Small injuries. In St. Mary Mead, nothing ever appeared important at first. That, Miss Marple often thought, was precisely why things became important later. A raised voice in a city might be forgotten within minutes, but in a village, even a misplaced teaspoon could acquire significance, given time and the right circumstances. And now, as she considered the quiet disturbances of the past week, she found herself increasingly certain that what others dismissed as coincidence was in fact something far more deliberate. The illness of Mrs. Adeline Harcourt became, for a day or two, the centre of conversation. It was not initially regarded as alarming, merely unfortunate. A touch of food poisoning, the doctor had said in that calm, reassuring manner that people preferred to believe. Nothing to be overly concerned about. And yet Miss Marple noticed that the explanation satisfied people not because it was convincing, but because it was convenient. One always prefers a simple answer, she murmured, as she listened to Mrs. Bantry recount the latest update, even when it does not entirely fit. She is recovering, Mrs. Bantry said, settling into her chair, though she gave everyone quite a fright. I am glad to hear it, Miss Marple replied, and she meant it. Illness, even when mild, was never a thing to be taken lightly. But her thoughts did not rest on Mrs. Harcourt's recovery. They lingered instead on the cause. You said it was jam? She asked. Yes, a gift from Miss Lydia Harper, the schoolteacher. Miss Marple's knitting paused for just a fraction of a second. Miss Harper, she repeated softly. Such a quiet girl, Mrs. Bantry continued, most conscientious. I cannot imagine how anything could have gone wrong. No, Miss Marple said gently. One would not imagine it. Miss Lydia Harper was indeed a quiet presence in the village, not unnoticed but not particularly remarked upon either. She was efficient in her work, polite in her manner, and possessed of that unobtrusive quality that allowed her to move through village life without drawing attention. The sort of person, Miss Marple had once observed, whom people trust without quite knowing why. And yet, there was nothing in Miss Harper's character, so far as anyone could see, that would suggest carelessness, let alone something more troubling. Jam is not so difficult to make, Mrs. Bantry said, unless, of course, something went quite wrong. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, unless something went wrong. The matter might have rested there, as so many small incidents did, had it not been for what followed. 2 days later, Mrs. Price Ridley's unfortunate preserves were mentioned again, but this time in a slightly different tone. "It is very odd," she insisted. "Yeah, and speaking to a small gathering outside the post office. The jar was perfectly sealed when I opened it, and yet the contents were entirely spoiled." "Perhaps the sugar was not sufficient," suggested one listener. "Nonsense," Mrs. Price Ridley replied sharply. "I follow the same method every year." Miss Marple, passing by, paused just long enough to hear that, and again that faint unease stirred. Spoilage, jam, illness, none of it, taken alone, was remarkable, but together. "A pattern," she murmured once more. That afternoon she encountered Miss Harper herself. The young woman was carrying a small basket, her expression thoughtful, though not troubled. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said politely. "Good afternoon, my dear," Miss Marple replied. She hesitated only briefly before adding, "I was sorry to hear about Mrs. Harcourt's illness." A faint shadow crossed Miss Harper's face. "Yes," she said. "So was I. I do hope the jam was not the cause." "You're not certain?" Miss Marple asked gently. Miss Harper shook her head. "I made it as I always do. There was nothing unusual about it." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "I am sure there was not," she said. "And yet," she added softly, "sometimes things occur without our intending them." Miss Harper gave a small, uncertain smile. "Yes," she said, "I suppose they do." But there was something in her tone, something Miss Marple could not quite define, that lingered after the conversation ended. Later that same day, another small incident came to light. Mr. Leonard Briggs, still displeased about his roses, discovered that a letter he had sent, one of some importance, had never reached its intended recipient. "Quite inexcusable," he declared. "The postal service is becoming most unreliable, and yet when the matter was investigated it appeared that the letter had never been posted at all." "But I distinctly remember placing it on the hall table," he insisted. "I intended to post it the next morning." Miss Marple, upon hearing this, felt that same quiet certainty grow stronger. Misplaced items, altered circumstances, small disruptions. Not accidents, she thought. Not entirely. That evening she sat once more in her garden, the fading light casting long, soft shadows across the lawn. Her knitting lay untouched beside her. "Each incident is small," she said softly. "Each one, by itself, meaningless. But together?" She did not finish the thought. She did not need to. The pattern was not yet complete, but it was forming. What troubled her most was not the events themselves, but their nature. None of them caused real harm, not at first. They inconvenienced, embarrassed, unsettled. They created discomfort. "A series of small injuries," she murmured. "Nothing more." And yet, there was something about that very restraint that she found unsettling, because it suggested control, and control, Miss Marple knew, implied intention. The following morning brought with it yet another disturbance. Mrs. Eliza Morton, who had previously misplaced her letter, now found herself the subject of a most unfortunate misunderstanding. A message she had supposedly sent, one containing rather pointed remarks, had reached the wrong person. "I would never have written such a thing," she insisted. "Never." But the damage, small though it was, had been done. "Most awkward," Mrs. Bantry said. "Entirely unnecessary." Miss Marple listened quietly. "Yes," she said, "unnecessary. But not random. That was the point. Nothing about it felt random anymore." Miss Marple rose and walked slowly along the garden path, her thoughts moving with increasing clarity. Each incident had affected a different person. Each had caused just enough discomfort to be noticed, but not enough to provoke serious investigation. "A careful hand," she murmured. "Very careful." She paused, looking out over the quiet village. But why? That was the question that mattered now. Not how, but why. What connected these people? Mrs. Price Ridley, Mr. Briggs, Mrs. Morton, Mrs. Harcourt. At first glance, nothing. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust first glances. "There is always something," she said softly. "Some small thread, or easily overlooked." She turned back toward the house, her expression thoughtful. Because if there was a pattern, and she was now quite certain there was, then it would not remain harmless for long. Such things never did. And somewhere, beneath the quiet surface of St. Mary Mead, something was being arranged. Carefully, patiently, one small injury at a time. Threads of the past. Miss Marple had often said that memory was the most underestimated faculty of the human mind. People assumed it to be unreliable, selective, or even trivial, but in truth, it was the quiet storehouse of everything that mattered. Not always immediately useful, of course. But given time, and the right question, memory had a way of producing exactly what was needed. It was with this thought in mind that she set aside her knitting entirely that morning and resolved to do something she rarely did without purpose, to call upon several of her neighbours, not for conversation alone, but for recollection. "Because," she murmured to herself as she adjusted her hat, "it is not the present that concerns me, but the past." Her first visit was to Mrs. Price Ridley. The lady in question received her with enthusiasm, though not without a lingering sense of grievance. "My preserves are still quite ruined," she declared almost at once. "I cannot imagine what could have caused it." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It must be most disappointing." "Disappointing," Mrs. Price Ridley repeated. "It is quite intolerable." Miss Marple allowed her to continue for a moment before gently guiding the conversation elsewhere. "You have lived here a long time, have you not?" she asked. "Nearly 15 years. And you have always made preserves?" "Of course." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then it seems most unlikely that such a mistake would occur without reason." "Exactly," Mrs. Price Ridley said, pleased to be understood. Miss Marple paused, then added, as if the thought had only just occurred to her, "I wonder, have you had any disagreements lately? Nothing serious, of course, just small misunderstandings." Mrs. Price Ridley blinked. "Disagreements?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "The sort that are easily forgotten, but not always entirely resolved." Mrs. Price Ridley hesitated. "Well, there was that business with Mrs. Harcourt," she said at last. Miss Marple's attention sharpened, though nothing in her expression changed. "Oh? Yes. A matter of a charity subscription. She implied, quite unfairly I might add, that I had been less than generous." "How very awkward," Miss Marple murmured. "Indeed, I did not appreciate it at all." Miss Marple inclined her head. "No, I imagine not." She did not press further. She did not need to. One thread lightly revealed. Her next visit was to Mr. Leonard Briggs. He received her in his garden, still tending to what remained of his roses. "A disgrace," he said, gesturing toward the damaged blooms. "Months of care, and for what?" Miss Marple sympathised appropriately before, once again, turning the conversation. "You have always taken great pride in your garden," she said. "Of course. And I believe Mrs. Harcourt admired it very much." Mr. Briggs snorted slightly. "She did more than admire it. She had opinions, constant opinions. Said I should change this, adjust that, as though she knew better." Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "That must have been rather trying." "It was," he said. "I told her so, more than once." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Another thread. Mrs. Eliza Morton proved somewhat more reluctant. She was still unsettled by the misunderstanding regarding the letter. "I cannot imagine how such a thing occurred," she said. "It has caused me considerable embarrassment." Miss Marple listened patiently. "And Mrs. Harcourt?" she asked, as though the name had only just come to mind. Mrs. Morton's lips tightened slightly. "She was present when the matter was discussed," she said, "and I cannot help feeling that she encouraged the misunderstanding." "Encouraged?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "Well, not directly, of course. But she has a way of guiding conversations." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "some people do." A third thread. By the time Miss Marple returned home, the pattern had shifted. Not in appearance, but in depth. It was no longer a series of unrelated incidents. It was something far more specific. Each small misfortune, each spoiled preserve, each damaged flower, each social discomfort, had touched someone who had, in some way, experienced friction with Mrs. Adeline Harcourt. Not great quarrels, not dramatic disputes, small things, subtle slights, unpleasant remarks. Nothing, Miss Marple murmured, that would be considered important. And yet, she sat down by the window, her hands resting quietly in her lap. "People rarely forgive small injuries," she said softly. "They forget them, Perhaps, but they do not forgive. The thought lingered, because if each of these individuals had been, in some small way, wronged by Mrs. Harcourt, then why were they the ones experiencing these peculiar misfortunes? It did not align, not yet. Unless... Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Unless, she murmured, the purpose is not punishment, but something else. She considered the spoiled jam, the illness, the quiet disturbances leading up to it. A progression, she said, carefully arranged. It was Mrs. Bantry who interrupted her thoughts, arriving with her usual brisk energy. "My dear Jane, you look positively absorbed," she said. "I am thinking," Miss Marple replied. "That is always a dangerous sign," Mrs. Bantry said lightly. "What is it this time?" Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Tell me," she said. "What do you think of Mrs. Harcourt?" Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "Well, she's very pleasant," she said. "Very capable, though—" "Yes?" Miss Marple prompted. "Well," Mrs. Bantry admitted, "she can be a little interfering." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "I think that is a fair description. She means well, of course. Of course." There was a pause. Then Miss Marple spoke again. "And Miss Harper?" "The schoolteacher?" Mrs. Bantry considered. "Quiet. Efficient. Keeps to herself." "Has she many friends?" "Not particularly." Miss Marple nodded. "And her connection to Mrs. Harcourt?" Mrs. Bantry frowned slightly. "I believe Mrs. Harcourt took a certain interest in her. Offered advice, guidance." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though not with amusement. "Yes," she said. "I thought as much." When Mrs. Bantry had gone, Miss Marple remained where she was, her thoughts now moving with quiet precision. The threads were no longer scattered. They were converging. Each small incident had affected someone connected, however lightly, to Mrs. Harcourt. But the nature of those connections was not random. They were corrective, balancing, as though someone had taken it upon themselves to address a series of past grievances. One by one, Miss Marple murmured, and then, at last, the final piece began to take shape. The jam, the illness, the escalation. She rose slowly, moving toward the window once more. Outside, St. Mary Mead remained unchanged, peaceful, orderly, unaware. But Miss Marple, watching the quiet movement of the afternoon light, allowed herself a small, thoughtful sigh. "Revenge," she said softly, "is rarely loud." It did not shout. It did not declare itself. It moved quietly, patiently, through small acts, small corrections, small injuries, until, at last, it became something else entirely. And now, Miss Marple thought, it was no longer a question of whether there was a pattern, but how far that pattern would go, because if the earlier incidents had been merely the beginning, then the illness of Mrs. Harcourt was not the end, not yet, and that more than anything else troubled her, because someone, somewhere in St. Mary Mead, was not finished. A pleasant lady, Miss Marple, had always held the opinion that it was far easier to understand a person when one listened to how others described them. Not what they said openly, of course, that was often shaped by politeness, but the small hesitations, the slight shifts in tone, the careful choice of words. These, she believed, revealed far more than direct statements ever could. And so, that afternoon, she resolved to consider Mrs. Adeline Harcourt, not as a victim of sudden illness, but as she had been in life. "A pleasant lady," Mrs. Bantry had said. "Very capable," Mrs. Price Ridley had remarked. "Helpful," Mrs. Morton had admitted, though not without a certain reservation. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded, allowing those impressions to settle. Pleasant, capable, helpful. Yes, all true, and yet not complete. Mrs. Harcourt had possessed charm. That much was undeniable. She had a way of speaking that put people at ease, a manner that suggested genuine interest, and a readiness to involve herself in the concerns of others. She attended to village matters, offered assistance when needed, and maintained a presence that many found reassuring. But Miss Marple had observed something else as well. "She's a lady," she had once remarked, "who prefers to arrange things. Not control, not in any overt sense, but guide, influence, suggest. A word here, a remark there, nothing that could be objected to directly. And yet, enough to alter outcomes. Miss Marple rose and moved slowly about the room. "It is a very subtle habit," she murmured, "and one that is often mistaken for kindness." She recalled now several small moments, barely noticeable at the time. A suggestion made at a charity meeting that had quietly shifted responsibility from one person to another. A remark about someone's garden that had resulted in an unexpected change. A conversation that had led, almost imperceptibly, to a misunderstanding between two otherwise agreeable neighbours. Nothing serious, nothing deliberate, at least not in any obvious way, but consistent. "Influence," Miss Marple said softly. That was the word. Mrs. Harcourt influenced people, and people, Miss Marple knew, did not always appreciate being influenced, particularly when they did not fully realise it was happening. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Haydock as he made his way along the lane. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully. "Good afternoon, Doctor. I believe you have heard about Mrs. Harcourt?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I was glad to learn she's improving." Dr. Haydock nodded. "Yes, nothing too serious. A rather unpleasant reaction, most likely something she consumed." "Jam, I believe," Miss Marple said. "Yes," he replied, "though I see no reason to suspect anything more than simple contamination." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course." She paused, then added gently, "Have you known Mrs. Harcourt long?" "A few years," he said. "A very capable woman, keeps herself busy." "And her temperament?" Dr. Haydock smiled faintly. "You're asking whether she had enemies, I suppose?" Miss Marple returned the smile. "I am asking whether she was always agreeable." Dr. Haydock considered. "Well," he said, "she could be rather firm in her opinions. Not everyone appreciated that." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Not everyone does." As she continued her walk, Miss Marple found her thoughts returning. Not to Mrs. Harcourt herself, but to those around her. Mrs. Price Ridley, subtly criticised. Mr. Briggs, frequently advised. Mrs. Morton, quietly embarrassed. And Miss Harper. Miss Marple paused. Yes, Miss Harper. The young schoolteacher had been mentioned only briefly in relation to Mrs. Harcourt, but something about that connection lingered. "Guidance," Mrs. Bantry had said. "Advice." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Advice," she repeated softly, "can be a very dangerous thing when it is not wanted." She turned her steps toward the small schoolhouse at the edge of the village. Lessons had ended for the day, but Miss Harper was still there, arranging papers with her usual careful precision. "Miss Marple," she said, looking up in mild surprise. "Good afternoon." "My dear," Miss Marple replied warmly, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." Miss Marple entered, her gaze taking in the neat arrangement of desks, the orderly rows of books. "You keep everything very tidy," she observed. "I prefer it that way," Miss Harper said. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "So do I." There was a brief pause. Then Miss Marple spoke, as though the thought had only just occurred to her. "I have been hearing a great deal about Mrs. Harcourt," she said. Miss Harper's hands stilled slightly. "Yes," she said, "so have I." "You were kind to send her that jar of jam." A faint flush appeared on Miss Harper's cheeks. "It was nothing," she said. "Just a small gift." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "And you have known her long?" "Not very," Miss Harper replied, "but she took an interest in me." "An interest?" Miss Marple repeated. "Yes, she was helpful." There was the slightest hesitation before the word. Miss Marple noticed it. "In what way?" she asked gently. Miss Harper looked down at her papers. "She offered advice," she said, "about the school, about how I might manage certain situations." "And did you find that advice useful?" Miss Harper hesitated again. "Sometimes," she said. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, very softly, "And at other times?" Miss Harper did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. "At other times," she said, "it felt as though she believed I could not manage without her." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Yes," she said, "that can be difficult." Miss Harper's hands tightened faintly on the paper she held. "Yes," she said again. There was a silence then, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. Miss Marple rose slowly. "You're very capable, my dear," she said. "I'm quite sure of it." Miss Harper looked up, surprised. "Thank you," she said. Miss Marple smiled gently. "One does not always need guidance," she added. particularly when it is not freely chosen. Miss Harper did not reply, but something in her expression changed. Something small, but unmistakable. As Miss Marple stepped outside once more, the late afternoon air felt cooler, the light softer. She walked slowly, her thoughts now moving with greater clarity. Mrs. Harcourt had not been cruel, not openly, but she had influenced, advised, directed, and in doing so she had created, over time, a series of small, quiet resentments. Nothing dramatic, Miss Marple murmured. Nothing that would ever be spoken aloud. But enough. Enough for someone to remember. Enough for someone to act. She paused at the gate looking out over the village. The earlier incidents, she said softly, they were not random. They had not been acts of malice, not entirely. They had been responses, small corrections, these small humiliations, given to those who had in some way caused similar discomfort. And now, the jam, the illness. Miss Marple's expression grew more serious. Escalation, she said quietly. That was the danger. Because once such a pattern began, it rarely stopped of its own accord. As she turned back toward her house, one thought remained, clear and steady. The person behind it all was not reckless, not impulsive, but careful, patient, and very, very observant. Someone who understood the weight of small injuries, because they had felt them over time. And now, Miss Marple thought, they were answering them, one by one, with a precision that was almost gentle until it was not. The taste of something bitter. Miss Marple slept very little that night, not from anxiety, but from thought. Her mind, once it had found a pattern, rarely rested until it had explored every corner of it. And now, the quiet disturbances of St. Mary Mead no longer appeared as isolated curiosities. They had formed themselves into something structured, something deliberate, and most importantly, something personal. By morning, her conclusions were not yet fixed, but they had direction. It is never only about what is done, she murmured as she poured her tea. It is about what is remembered. The village, however, continued as it always did, unaware or perhaps unwilling to see beyond the surface. The illness of Mrs. Harcourt was already being spoken of as an unfortunate but passing matter. She is quite recovered now, Mrs. Bantry reported later that morning. Up and about again. Quite her usual self, I'm told. Miss Marple inclined her head. That is good news, she said, and yet, inwardly, she did not feel reassured, because the recovery rather than closing the matter only sharpened it. If the jam had caused illness once, what might it do again? That afternoon, Miss Marple took a small but deliberate step. She paid a visit, not to Mrs. Harcourt nor to Mrs. Bantry, but to the modest cottage where Miss Lydia Harper resided. The young schoolteacher answered the door herself. "Miss Marple," she said, surprised. "How nice to see you." "My dear," Miss Marple replied warmly, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Please do come in." The cottage was neat, precisely as Miss Marple expected. Everything in its place, everything carefully arranged. There was a quiet order to it that spoke not only of discipline, but of control. "You keep a very pleasant home," Miss Marple observed. "I try to," Miss Harper said, with a small smile. They sat together, and for a few moments the conversation remained entirely ordinary. The school, the children, the mildness of the season, nothing of consequence. And then, gently, Miss Marple shifted the tone. "I was thinking about your jam," she said. Miss Harper's smile faltered just slightly. "Yes? It was most kind of you to give it to Mrs. Harcourt." "It was nothing," Miss Harper said again. "Just something I had made." Miss Marple nodded. "And you have made it often before?" "Yes." "Without difficulty?" "Yes." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her calmly. And yet this time, something was not quite right. Miss Harper's hands folded tightly in her lap. "It would seem so," she said. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice still gentle. "My dear," she said, have you ever noticed how sometimes a small mistake can have rather large consequences?" Miss Harper looked up, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said quietly, "I have noticed that." There was a pause. Miss Marple did not press. She simply allowed the silence to exist, because she knew that silence, properly used, often encouraged truth more effectively than questions. At last Miss Harper spoke again. "I was very sorry," she said. "When I heard she had been ill—" "I'm sure you were," Miss Marple replied. Miss Harper's gaze dropped. "I would never have intended such a thing." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "I do not believe you would." That at least was true, but intention, Miss Marple knew, was not always the same as outcome. After a few more minutes of polite conversation, Miss Marple rose to leave. At the door, she paused. "My dear," she said gently, "one must always be careful with things that appear harmless." Miss Harper met her gaze. "Yes," she said. "I understand that." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I believe you do." As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple's thoughts were clearer than before, but also more troubling. Miss Harper was not reckless, she was not foolish, and she was not unaware. That much was certain. "Careful," Miss Marple murmured. That was the word. Everything that had happened so far had been careful, measured, controlled. Even the illness, unpleasant though it was, had not been fatal. Not yet. But the question remained. Was it meant to be? That evening Miss Marple sat once more in her garden, the quiet settling around her like a familiar presence. She thought again of the earlier incidents, the spoiled preserves, the damaged roses, the misplaced letter, the small humiliations, each one directed, each one precise, each one proportionate. "Not cruelty," she said softly. "Correction." It was a curious distinction, but an important one. Whoever was responsible had not acted out of sudden anger. They had acted with purpose. Each small act had been a response to something that had come before, a balance of sorts, a settling of accounts, and then— the jam. Miss Marple's expression grew more serious. "Escalation," she repeated quietly. Because the jam was different. It was no longer a small inconvenience, no longer a minor embarrassment. It had crossed a line, not fully, but enough. She rose slowly, her hands clasped together. "In such matters," she said, "there is always a moment when one might stop, a point at which the pattern could end, at which the balance could be considered restored. But if that moment was missed, if the desire to correct became something more, then the next step was inevitable." Miss Marple turned toward the house. Her thoughts settled now into something firmer. "This is not finished," she said softly. Because Miss Lydia Harper, quiet and careful though she was, had not yet reached that moment, and somewhere, beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, something was still unfolding, patiently, deliberately, with the same gentle precision that had marked every step so far. The sweetest things, Miss Marple reflected, were often the most deceptive. Jam, for instance, simple, pleasant, harmless, until, of course, it was not. The jar that remained. Miss Marple had always believed that when something went wrong in a kitchen, the evidence seldom vanished entirely. It lingered in the smallest details, a spoon not quite clean, a lid not properly sealed, a jar placed just slightly out of its usual position. Such things, insignificant to most, were often the quiet witnesses to intention. The following morning she set out with a purpose more defined than before. "If one wishes to understand the present," she murmured, "one must examine what remains of it." Her destination was Mrs. Harcourt's house. The lady herself, now much recovered, received Miss Marple with her usual composed charm. "My dear Miss Marple," she said warmly, "how kind of you to call. I'm quite myself again, I assure you." "I am very glad to hear it," Miss Marple replied, taking her seat. "Such an illness must have been most unpleasant." "Extremely," Mrs. Harcourt said lightly. "Though I am told it was nothing serious, a mere reaction to something I ate." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently, "and I believe it was jam." Mrs. Harcourt gave a small laugh. "Yes, a gift from Miss Harper. Most unfortunate, really." There was something in her tone, not bitterness exactly, but a faint trace of dismissal that Miss Marple noted at once. "You were fond of her, I believe?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Harcourt's expression remained pleasant. "Oh yes, a very capable young woman, though of course she does benefit from a little guidance." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Yes," she said. "I imagine she does." There was a pause. Then Miss Marple spoke again, as though idly. "You still have the jar, I suppose?" Mrs. Harcourt hesitated. "The jar?" Yes, Miss Marple said softly. The one containing the jam. Oh, well, I believe it is still in the kitchen. I'd not thought to discard it. May I see it? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Harcourt seemed mildly surprised, but not suspicious. Of course, she said, if you wish. The kitchen was as orderly as the rest of the house. Mrs. Harcourt moved to a small cupboard and produced the jar in question. There it is, she said, though I cannot imagine it will be of much interest. Miss Marple accepted it with careful hands. On the contrary, she said gently, such things are often very instructive. The jar was, at first glance, entirely ordinary. The label was neat, written in Miss Harper's precise hand. The lid was properly sealed, and yet... Miss Marple turned it slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. Yes, she murmured. What is it? Mrs. Harcourt asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she examined the contents more closely. The jam itself appeared darker than it should have been. Not spoiled in the obvious sense, but altered, subtly. Did you notice anything unusual about the taste? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Harcourt frowned slightly. Well, it was a little sharp, perhaps, but I did not think much of it at the time. Miss Marple nodded. No, she said, one would not. She replaced the lid carefully. And you consumed only a small amount? Yes, fortunately. Very fortunate, Miss Marple said softly. There was a brief silence. Then Miss Marple spoke again. May I ask, did anyone else taste it? Mrs. Harcourt shook her head. No, I was alone. Miss Marple inclined her head. I see. As they returned to the sitting room, Miss Marple's thoughts moved with quiet certainty. The jar had not been carelessly prepared. It had not been accidentally spoiled. It had been altered, deliberately, but not in a way that would be immediately detected. Careful, she murmured again. Always careful. Do you believe it was simply a mistake? Mrs. Harcourt asked, her tone light but curious. Miss Marple met her gaze. I believe, she said gently, that it would be unwise to assume anything too quickly. Mrs. Harcourt smiled faintly. You're always so cautious. Yes, Miss Marple said. I have found it useful. After taking her leave, Miss Marple did not return home at once. Instead, she walked slowly along the lane, her thoughts turning over the new piece of the puzzle. The jar had been prepared with intention. That much was now beyond doubt. But the nature of that intention, that remained uncertain. She did not wish to kill, Miss Marple said softly. No, that did not fit. Miss Harper was too controlled for that, too measured, too precise. But she had wished to do something that went beyond the earlier incidents, something that crossed the boundary between discomfort and danger. Miss Marple paused, looking out across the quiet fields. What changes, she murmured, when one moves from small injuries or to something more serious? The answer came at once. Emotion. The earlier acts had been balanced, proportionate, each one a response, a correction. But the jam was different. It was not merely a response. It was personal. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. Something changed, she said. Something that made the balance no longer sufficient. She turned back toward the village, her pace slow but steady. Because now, she understood that the pattern had not simply progressed, it had shifted, and that meant there was a moment, a specific point, at which everything had altered. A moment when Miss Harper had moved from quiet correction to something far more dangerous. That is what I must find, Miss Marple said softly. The moment. Behind her, in the quiet kitchen of Mrs. Harcourt's house, the jar of jam remained where it had been placed. Unremarkable, ordinary, deceptively simple, and yet, within it lay the clearest evidence of all, not of carelessness, not of accident, but of intention. The sweetest things, Miss Marple reflected once more, were often the most carefully prepared, and therefore the most revealing, because sweetness, when altered, could become something else entirely, something sharp, something bitter, something that lingered. Just like memory and just like resentment. And now Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty she was very close, not to the act, but to the reason behind it, and in matters such as these, The reason was everything. The moment that changed everything. Miss Marple had always maintained that people rarely acted without a reason, but more importantly, they rarely acted without a moment. A single point in time when thought became decision and decision became action. It was not always dramatic. Often it was quiet, almost invisible, but it existed. And now, as she sat by her window that afternoon, Miss Marple knew that she must find that moment. Because without it, she murmured, the pattern remains incomplete. Everything, up to a certain point, had been measured. The spoiled preserves, an inconvenience. The damaged roses, a frustration. The misplaced letter, a mild embarrassment. Each act had been carefully balanced. A reflection, perhaps, of something that had been done before. A subtle correction, not cruel, only deliberate. But the jam, that had been different. That had carried risk, and risk, Miss Marple knew, was never taken lightly by someone as careful as Miss Lydia Harper. No, she said softly, something changed. The question was, what? She rose and took a slow walk through the village, not with any particular destination, but with the quiet intention of observing. St. Mary Mead, as always, appeared unchanged. Children played near the green. Voices drifted lightly from open windows. The ordinary rhythm of life continued, undisturbed. But Miss Marple did not look at the surface. She listened. It was outside the post office that she heard the first hint of it. Mrs. Price Ridley was speaking, her voice just slightly sharper than usual. "I only meant to help," she was saying, "but some people are so sensitive." "And who was that?" asked another voice. Miss Marple paused, her attention gently fixed. "Oh, Miss Harper," Mrs. Price Ridley replied. "It was some time ago, of course. A small matter at the school." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "A small matter," she repeated quietly to herself. She did not interrupt. She did not ask questions. She simply listened. "She had arranged something quite incorrectly," Mrs. Price Ridley continued. "I pointed it out, quite politely I might add, but she seemed upset." "Well," the other voice said, "young people can be rather sensitive." "Yes," Mrs. Price Ridley agreed, "though I cannot imagine why." Miss Marple moved on, her thoughts deepening, not criticism. Not cruelty, but correction. Public, perhaps. Unwelcome. "A small injury," she murmured. Her next discovery came not by chance, but by quiet intention. She called upon Mrs. Morton once more. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Morton said. "How good of you to visit again." Miss Marple smiled. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." They spoke for a few minutes before Miss Marple very gently returned to the matter at hand. "I have been thinking about Mrs. Harcourt," she said. Mrs. Morton's expression shifted slightly. "Yes," she said. "She has been much discussed." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I wonder, did she ever involve herself in your affairs?" Mrs. Morton hesitated. "Well, yes, in small ways." "Such as?" Mrs. Morton looked uncomfortable. "She once repeated something I had said, quite out of context. It caused a great deal of embarrassment." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "And Miss Harper?" Mrs. Morton blinked. "Miss Harper?" "Yes." "Well, I believe Mrs. Harcourt advised her on several occasions, about the school, about discipline." "And did that advice remain private?" Mrs. Morton hesitated again. "Not entirely," she admitted. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Another thread. By the time she returned home, the shape of the moment had begun to form. Not a single incident, but a series. Small corrections, small embarrassments, given by Mrs. Harcourt and others to Miss Harper, always under the guise of helpfulness, always polite, always public. Miss Marple sat down, her hands resting lightly in her lap. "Not cruelty," she said again, "but something that feels like it. Because for someone like Miss Harper, quiet, careful, or self-contained, such moments would not pass easily, they would not be forgotten, they would be stored." "One does not protest," Miss Marple murmured. "One remembers. And then, at some point, one acts." The question was no longer whether Miss Harper had reason. She had, in abundance. The question now was, when had that reason become action? Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, allowing the events to settle into place. The earlier incidents had been responses to others. Mrs. Price Ridley, Mr. Briggs, Mrs. Morton. Each had in some way caused discomfort to Miss Harper, or perhaps to others, and each had received in return a small measured inconvenience. But Mrs. Harcourt, she was different. She was not merely part of the pattern, Miss Marple said softly. She was the centre of it. The others had been corrected, balanced, repaid. But Mrs. Harcourt, she had influenced, advised, directed, repeated, exposed, and perhaps, without realising it, she had done so once too often. Miss Marple's eyes opened slowly. Yes, she said, that is the moment. Not a single event, but an accumulation, a quiet, steady pressure, until, at last, something shifted. She felt it, Miss Marple murmured, the final indignity, and after that, the careful balance of earlier acts was no longer enough, because resentment, when it grows slowly, does not fade, it deepens, it sharpens, it waits, and then it changes. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the window once more. Outside, the village remained peaceful, unchanged, unaware, but she knew now that the pattern was complete, the reason understood, the moment identified, and that left only one thing, the truth, not yet spoken, but very close. Revenge, Miss Marple said softly, is rarely sudden. It is built, piece by piece, moment by moment, until it becomes something inevitable. And in St. Mary Mead, that inevitability had already begun, quietly, carefully, sweetly, until it turned, just slightly, bitter. A carefully measured hand. Miss Marple did not believe in haste. Indeed, she often found that the desire to reach a conclusion too quickly was the very thing that led people away from the truth. And now, though the pattern had revealed itself with increasing clarity, she resisted the temptation to declare it complete. Because, she murmured, as she folded her knitting with deliberate care, understanding a reason is not the same as proving an action. She knew why Miss Lydia Harper might act. She knew how the small injuries had accumulated, how the quiet humiliations had taken root over time. But knowing was not enough. There must be something more, something that transformed suspicion into certainty. That afternoon she paid a visit once more to the schoolhouse. Miss Harper was there, as always, methodical, composed, her presence as unobtrusive as ever. "Miss Marple," she said politely, though her eyes flickered with something just slightly more guarded than before. "You're becoming quite a regular visitor." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I hope I'm not unwelcome." "Not at all." They spoke briefly of ordinary matters, the children, the lessons, the steady routine of village life. But beneath it, Miss Marple sensed a tension, not overt, not even conscious perhaps, but present, a tightening, a quiet awareness. At last Miss Marple spoke. "My dear," she said, "I have been thinking a great deal about small things." Miss Harper looked at her, puzzled. "Small things?" "Yes, the sort that most people overlook." Miss Harper gave a faint smile. "There are many such things." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and yet they are often the most revealing." She paused, then continued, her voice as gentle as ever. "For instance, the spoiled preserves." Miss Harper's expression did not change, but her stillness deepened. "Or the roses." A flicker, barely perceptible. "The misplaced letter." Now Miss Harper looked down, her hands resting very carefully on the table. Miss Marple did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply observed. "Each incident," she said softly, "was very precise." There was a silence. Then Miss Harper spoke. "I do not understand what you mean." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "No," she said. "Perhaps not." She moved to the window, her gaze resting on the quiet yard beyond. "But I think you do," she added, almost as an afterthought. Miss Harper's voice, when it came again, was steady. "You believe I am responsible for these things?" Miss Marple turned back toward her. "I believe," she said gently, "that they were not accidents." Another silence. Longer this time, heavier. Miss Harper rose slowly. "You have no proof," she said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she agreed, "I do not." There was something in the simplicity of the reply that unsettled more than an accusation might have. Miss Harper's composure wavered, just slightly. "I have always done my duties," she said. "I have caused no harm to anyone." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "Harm," she said softly, "is not always obvious." Miss Harper turned away, her hands tightening at her sides. "I've been treated with nothing but kindness here," she said. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply waited. After a moment, Miss Harper spoke again. "People mean well," she added. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "They often do." There it was. Not anger, not denial, but something deeper, something closer to truth. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. "My dear," she said, "it is a very difficult thing to accept correction when one has done nothing to deserve it." Miss Harper's shoulders stiffened. "I have never objected," she said. "No," Miss Marple replied. "You have not." And that, Miss Marple knew, was precisely the point. She moved toward the door. "I shall not keep you," she said. Miss Harper did not turn. At the threshold, Miss Marple paused. "One must be careful," she said softly, "when balancing small wrongs." Miss Harper's voice came, quiet but firm. "I have done nothing wrong." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course," she said. She stepped outside, closing the door gently behind her. The air felt cooler now, though the day had not changed. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the village, her thoughts steady. She had not needed a confession. She had not expected one, but she had seen enough. "Control," she murmured. That was the key. Everything Miss Harper had done had been controlled, measured, exact. Even now, even in the face of suspicion. Miss Marple paused, her gaze resting on the distant rooftops. "The earlier acts," she said softly, "were careful. They had caused discomfort, but not danger. They had corrected, but not harmed. But the jam," her expression grew more serious. "That was different. Because it had crossed the line. Not entirely, but enough." Miss Marple resumed her walk. "She tells herself," she murmured, "that she has done nothing wrong." And perhaps, in her own mind, that was true, because she had not acted in anger, not in haste, not in cruelty. She had acted with reason, with patience, with balance, until the balance shifted. Miss Marple reached her gate and paused. "Revenge," she said softly, "is most dangerous when it believes itself justified." And Miss Lydia Harper, quiet, careful, overlooked Miss Harper, believed exactly that. The pattern was complete, the reason understood, the hand revealed, and now there remained only one question. Had the final step already been taken? Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the quiet village beyond. Because if the jam had been only a warning, then what came next would not be. The sweetness turns. Miss Marple did not like waiting, but she understood its necessity. In matters of human nature, one could not simply arrive at the truth and announce it. The truth, she had learned, required its own moment. A moment when it revealed itself not by force, but by inevitability. And so she waited. Not idly, but attentively. Watching. Listening. For 2 days, nothing happened. St. Mary Mead resumed its quiet rhythm, the earlier disturbances already fading into the comfortable category of unfortunate occurrences. Mrs. Harcourt, fully recovered, reappeared in society with her usual composure. Conversations returned to ordinary matters. The tension, such as it had been, dissolved into the background. To most, it seemed the matter had ended. To Miss Marple, it had only paused. It was on the third morning that the change came, not with drama, not with alarm, but with something so small that it might easily have been overlooked. Miss Marple was at the vicarage, seated with Mrs. Bantry, when the maid entered with the morning post. "A parcel for Mrs. Harcourt, ma'am," she said. Mrs. Bantry looked up. "Oh? From whom?" "There is no name, ma'am." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "No name?" Mrs. Bantry repeated. "No, ma'am, only the address." Miss Marple's eyes rested quietly on the parcel as it was set aside. Plain, unremarkable, and yet... "Curious," Mrs. Bantry said lightly, "though I suppose people do forget such things." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "they do." But her thoughts had already begun to move, because forgetfulness did not belong in a pattern built on precision. Later that morning news arrived. Mrs. Harcourt had received the parcel, and within it, another jar of jam. Miss Marple did not need to be told. She knew. She did not stop, she murmured. Mrs. Bantry, upon hearing the news, was amused rather than alarmed. "Well, I hope this one is better than the last," she said. "Though I should be cautious if I were her." Miss Marple did not smile. "Yes," she said. "She should be very cautious." "Do you think it is from Miss Harper again?" Mrs. Bantry asked. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." There was a brief silence. Then Mrs. Bantry looked at her more closely. "My dear Jane," she said, "you sound almost concerned." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "I am concerned," she said. She rose slowly. "I believe," she added, "that we must go to Mrs. Harcourt at once." The walk was not long, but Miss Marple did not hurry. Haste, she knew, rarely improved matters, but her mind was clear now, certain. She has crossed the line, she thought, not by accident, not by misjudgment, but by decision. When they arrived, Mrs. Harcourt received them in her sitting room, the newly arrived jar placed neatly on the table before her. "My dear Miss Marple," she said pleasantly, "you have come at a most interesting moment." Miss Marple's gaze rested on the jar. "Yes," she said softly, "so I see." "It appears I've been sent another gift," Mrs. Harcourt continued with a faint smile, "though I must confess I am not entirely certain I wish to accept it." Miss Marple stepped closer. "May I?" she asked. "Of course." She examined the jar carefully. The label was the same, the handwriting precise. Everything, at first glance, identical. And yet, Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her certainty deepened. "It is unopened," Mrs. Harcourt said. "I thought it best to wait." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That was very wise." Mrs. Bantry, watching, began to lose her lightness. "My dear Jane," she said, "what is it?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately, and instead she turned to Mrs. Harcourt. "You must not eat this," she said quietly. The room fell still. Mrs. Harcourt's smile faded, just slightly. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, "you cannot mean—" "I do," Miss Marple replied. There was a pause. Then Mrs. Harcourt laughed lightly. "Surely this is an exaggeration." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "No," she said. Mrs. Bantry looked from one to the other, her expression now uncertain. "Jane, you don't think—" Miss Marple turned to her. "I do not think," she said. "I know." Silence settled heavily in the room. Mrs. Harcourt's composure shifted. Not entirely, but enough. "This is a serious accusation," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It is." "And you have proof?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No." Mrs. Harcourt's expression sharpened slightly. "Then on what do you base this certainty?" Miss Marple looked at the jar, then back at Mrs. Harcourt. "On pattern," she said softly. She stepped back slightly, her voice calm, measured. The earlier incidents, the small disturbances, were not accidents. They were deliberate, each one directed, each one precise. Mrs. Bantry stared at her. "You mean—" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "They were acts of correction." Mrs. Harcourt's eyes narrowed faintly. "Correction?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "For small injuries, small humiliations, small influences." A pause. "And the jam?" Mrs. Harcourt asked quietly. Miss Marple's voice softened. "The jam," she said, "was different." She looked at the jar once more. It was personal. The silence deepened. "And this?" Mrs. Harcourt asked, gesturing to the new jar. Miss Marple met her gaze. "This," she said quietly, "is the end of the pattern." No one spoke, because now it was no longer a matter of suspicion, or curiosity, or quiet unease. It was something else entirely, something final. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "Revenge," she said softly, "when it begins with small things, rarely remains small." And in that quiet room, with the untouched jar resting between them, the truth, though not yet fully spoken, had already arrived. The truth in plain sight. For several moments after Miss Marple's quiet declaration, no one spoke. The stillness in the room felt different now, not uncertain, but settled. The kind of silence that follows when something unspoken has at last been given shape. Mrs. Harcourt was the first to move. She did not reach for the jar. Instead, she drew back slightly in her chair, her composed expression no longer quite as effortless as before. "This is a most extraordinary suggestion," she said carefully. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "it is." Mrs. Bantry looked between them, her earlier lightness entirely gone. "Jane," she said, "you must explain yourself." Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "I will," she said, "though I believe in many ways the explanation is already before us." She turned her gaze toward the jar. "Everything that has happened in the past days has followed a pattern," she began. "A very careful pattern. Small incidents, each one directed toward a particular person, each one causing inconvenience, embarrassment, or mild distress, but nothing more." Mrs. Bantry nodded slowly. "Yes, the preserves, the roses, the letters." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "And each of those individuals shared one thing in common." Mrs. Harcourt's eyes sharpened slightly. "And what is that?" she asked. Miss Marple met her gaze calmly. "They had, in some small way, caused discomfort to Miss Lydia Harper." There was a faint shift in the air. Mrs. Bantry looked startled. "Miss Harper? But—" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Miss Harper. Quiet, careful, observant Miss Harper. The sort of person who notices everything and says very little." Mrs. Harcourt gave a faint dismissive smile. "You are suggesting that she is responsible for these childish acts." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that she has been balancing accounts." Mrs. Bantry stared at her. "Balancing? Jane, you cannot mean—" "I do," Miss Marple said softly. "She was not acting out of impulse, nor out of cruelty. Each act was measured, proportionate, a response to something that had come before." Mrs. Harcourt's expression remained controlled, but there was a faint tension now beneath it. "And the jam?" she asked. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "The jam was the point at which the pattern changed." She stepped slightly closer, her gaze steady. "The earlier incidents were careful, harmless in a sense, but the jam introduced risk." Mrs. Bantry shivered slightly. "But she didn't mean to harm Mrs. Harcourt. Surely not?" Miss Marple hesitated, just for a moment. "I believe," she said, "that Miss Harper did not begin with the intention of causing serious harm." Mrs. Harcourt's eyes narrowed. "But she did," she said quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. There was a silence. Then Mrs. Harcourt spoke again. "And now you believe she intends to do so? Deliberately?" Miss Marple looked once more at the jar. "Yes," she said. Mrs. Bantry let out a small breath. "But why? Why escalate in such a way?" Miss Marple turned her gaze toward her. "Because," she said softly, "the earlier acts were not enough." She paused, then continued. "Miss Harper endured a series of small humiliations, not from one person alone, but from several, each incident perhaps insignificant in itself, but together, quite difficult to bear." Mrs. Harcourt's voice was cool. "And you place me among these offenders?" Miss Marple met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said. For a moment something flickered in Mrs. Harcourt's expression. Not guilt, not fear, but recognition. "You were kind," Miss Marple continued gently. "You offered advice, guidance, assistance." Mrs. Harcourt lifted her chin slightly. "I did." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "But such guidance is not always welcome, particularly when it is given publicly, repeatedly, and without invitation." Mrs. Bantry shifted uneasily. "My dear Jane, surely that cannot justify—" "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "It does not justify it, but it explains it." She turned back to Mrs. Harcourt. "You did not intend harm," she said, "but you influenced, you corrected, you exposed, and you did so often enough that the effect accumulated." Mrs. Harcourt's composure wavered slightly. "I only wished to help," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I believe you did." There was a pause. Then Miss Marple spoke again, more softly. But Miss Harper did not experience it as help. The room was very still now. "She remembered," Miss Marple continued. "She observed. And she began, quietly, to respond." Mrs. Bantry shook her head faintly. "The preserves, the roses, the letters. Yes, Miss Marple said. Each one a small correction, a reflection of something that had been done to her, or to others like her. Mrs. Harcourt's voice was almost a whisper now. And the jam? Miss Marple's gaze rested on the jar. The jam, she said, was not merely a correction. She lifted her eyes. It was personal. A long silence followed. And this? Mrs. Harcourt asked, her voice tight. Miss Marple answered without hesitation. This is the final act, Mrs. Bantry gasped softly. Then we must send for the police at once. Miss Marple raised a hand gently. Yes, she said, we must. But she didn't move, not yet, because there was one thing more. She turned once more to Mrs. Harcourt. My dear, she said quietly, you must understand. This did not begin with malice. Mrs. Harcourt looked at her, her expression no longer composed but uncertain. It began, Miss Marple said, with small injuries. She paused. And those, I have found, are often the most dangerous of all. No one spoke. The jar remained untouched, silent, ordinary. And yet, within that quiet object, lay the full weight of everything that had come before. Miss Marple folded her hands once more. The truth, she said softly, is rarely hidden by complexity. She looked from one to the other. More often, she added, it is hidden by how small it first appears. And now, at last, there was nothing left to uncover, only to face. The sweetest reckoning. The silence in Mrs. Harcourt's sitting room did not break all at once. It softened, shifted, and then, inevitably, gave way to reality. Mrs. Bantry was the first to move with purpose. This cannot be left as it is, she said, her voice firm despite its tremor. Jane, we must inform the authorities. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said quietly, we must. But even as the decision settled in the room, there was a sense that something else, something more immediate, still remained unfinished. Mrs. Harcourt rose slowly. For the first time since Miss Marple had known her, she seemed uncertain, not outwardly shaken, but inwardly unsettled. I should like to see her, she said. Mrs. Bantry blinked. See Miss Harper. My dear, that hardly seems— It is necessary, Mrs. Harcourt said, more firmly now. Miss Marple regarded her for a moment, then nodded. Yes, she said softly, I believe it is. The walk to the schoolhouse felt longer than usual. No one spoke much. The quiet of St. Mary Mead remained unchanged. The same gentle stillness, the same untroubled appearance. And yet, for those who walked together now, that stillness held a different weight. Such things, Miss Marple thought, are always hidden beneath the ordinary. Miss Harper was inside, as expected. She looked up as they entered, her expression calm, but not surprised. I wondered if you would come, she said. Mrs. Bantry drew in a breath. Then you know. Miss Marple lifted a hand gently. Let her speak, she said. Miss Harper stood very still. Her gaze moved briefly to Mrs. Harcourt, then returned to Miss Marple. You have told them, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. There was no accusation in her voice, no triumph, only quiet certainty. Miss Harper nodded once. I thought you might, she said. Mrs. Bantry could contain herself no longer. Then it is true, she asked. The jam, the other things, you did them? Miss Harper did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the desk and rested her hands lightly upon it. When something is done repeatedly, she said at last, people begin to believe it is nothing. Her voice was calm, measured. But it is not nothing. Mrs. Harcourt spoke then, her tone controlled but strained. You mean my advice? She said. Miss Harper looked at her. Yes, she said simply. I only wish to help, Mrs. Harcourt replied. Yes, Miss Harper said again. You did. There was no bitterness in the words, which somehow made them heavier. Miss Marple watched quietly. This, she knew, was the true heart of it. Not the acts themselves, but what had led to them. It was always small, Miss Harper continued. A remark, a suggestion, a correction. She paused. In front of others. Mrs. Harcourt's expression shifted. I did not realize. No, Miss Harper said gently. You did not. There was a silence. Then Miss Harper spoke again. At first, I thought it was my fault. That I had done something wrong. That I needed your guidance. Her hands tightened slightly. But it did not stop. Mrs. Bantry looked deeply uncomfortable now. My dear, she said. Surely you could have said something. Miss Harper shook her head. No, she said. That would have been impolite. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Yes, she murmured. It often is. And so, Miss Harper continued, I said nothing. She looked down briefly. But I remembered. The room was very still. The others, Miss Harper said, they were the same. Mrs. Price Ridley, Mr. Briggs, Mrs. Morton. All of them corrected, advised, adjusted. She lifted her gaze again. And they did not notice either. Miss Marple nodded slightly. No, she said, they would not. So I began, Miss Harper said, with small things. Her voice did not change. The preserves, the roses, the letters. Mrs. Bantry shivered. Good heavens. They were not meant to harm, Miss Harper said, only to balance. Miss Marple spoke softly. Yes, she said. I understood that. Miss Harper's gaze shifted to Mrs. Harcourt once more. But it was not enough, she said. Mrs. Harcourt drew in a breath. And so, you chose me. Miss Harper did not look away. Yes, the word settled heavily. The first jar, she continued, was not meant to kill. Mrs. Bantry whispered, Not meant. It was meant to make you ill, Miss Harper said calmly. To make you feel something unexpected, something you could not control. Mrs. Harcourt's composure faltered. And the second? She asked. Miss Harper was silent for a moment. Then, I was not certain, she said. That was all. No drama, no confession shaped by emotion, only truth. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. My dear, she said gently, that is where it changed. Miss Harper looked at her. Yes, she said. There was no denial now, no justification, and only recognition. Mrs. Bantry pressed a hand to her chest. This is dreadful, she murmured. Mrs. Harcourt stood very still. I never meant, she began. Miss Harper interrupted her, not sharply but quietly. I know, she said. And that, Miss Marple thought, was the tragedy of it. Because intention, however kind, did not erase effect, and effect, once felt deeply enough, could take on a life of its own. After a long moment, Miss Marple spoke. We must inform the authorities, she said gently. Miss Harper nodded. Yes, she said. Of course. There was no resistance, no attempt to escape, only acceptance. As arrangements were made and the quiet machinery of consequence began to turn, Miss Marple stepped outside. The air was cool, the afternoon light soft across the village. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. Mrs. Bantry joined her, her expression troubled. My dear Jane, she said, I cannot decide whether this is more sad or more shocking. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl lightly. Often, she said, it is both. They stood together for a moment. It all seems so small, Mrs. Bantry added. Such little things. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said. That is how it begins. She looked out across St. Mary Mead, the quiet houses, the neat gardens, the calm that concealed so much more than it revealed. People imagine that great wrongs are what cause great consequences, she said softly. But it is not so. She turned slightly. It is the small things, she said. The ones that are repeated. The ones that are dismissed. The ones that are never spoken of. Mrs. Bantry shivered faintly. And this was the result? Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Yes, she said. There was a long silence. Then Mrs. Bantry spoke again, more quietly. The sweetest revenge, she said, turned out to be the bitterest of all. Miss Marple gave a faint, thoughtful smile. Yes, she said, it usually does. And in St. Mary Mead life would go on, as it always did. The gardens would bloom, the conversations would resume, the quiet rhythm would return. But beneath it, as Miss Marple knew all too well, the memory of what had happened would remain. Not loudly, not openly, but quietly, like something once sweet, that had, over time, turned bitter.